Well, good afternoon, listeners. You're listening to Lament of Hope blog and podcast, and you're here today with Danielle Richardson. I'm your host, and I'm really excited today. I'm speaking with Deanne Bray, who is a deaf actress. So I actually, for those of you who are watching this live, which I would recommend because then you can see Deanne but and see her signing and you actually will see the interpreter. For those who are listening via audio, you're only going to hear the interpreter. So I do recommend, giving the video a look because then you can actually see what's going on. But for those who can't, whether you're commuting or whatever, you will be able to hear the translator giving an audio for what she's signing. Um, but Deanne, I wanted to ask to start out, I know you were born deaf. Have you ever um, experienced a time in your life when you were really envious of other people who could hear and wished that you had experienced that at some point? Or have you ever wrestled with the fact that you are deaf and that is something that is going to be your life story for as long as you're here?
Um, I never really understood that concept that you just explained. I never really felt like I wish I could hear. I mean, I can't speak for all deaf people and everybody in the deaf community. There may be some deaf people that feel that way for sure. But for me, no, I never really related to that. Both of my parents were very involved in my life. They really put me out there in natural settings where deaf people were signing. Plus also hearing people who were my age and I learned to speak and interact with hearing people and deaf people. So I had a balance. So my journey, I would say it's balanced. Um,
Hmm.
I really got my needs met and my identity. I discovered early on in life. So there was really no sort of struggle to find my identity. But I would say there's one area where I had a question, and that was this word of hard of hearing. Because in the 1970s, as a little girl, I was labeled as hard of hearing, which is a different definition than we speak of today. So that was one concept that I wasn't sure about, that identity. But I always grew up thinking, yeah, I'm deaf. And it's because I was born that way. And I don't know what it's like to be a hearing person. So I never really had that concept or that, like you said, that desire or wish that I could hear like other hearing people around me. However, I did meet several deaf individuals over my lifetime, and I would say maybe about 12 when I was up in Seattle, when I was about 12 years old. I remember seeing them and introducing me this concept of like get me to not sign because they were embarrassed. They didn't want me to draw attention to them. And so introduced me to this concept of total communication or what's called simultaneous communication, SIMCOM, which means, yeah, simultaneously communicating. Um, and that was the first time I saw that when I was 12. But where I grew up in Ventura County, California, in Southern California, the people that I interacted with in the places that my parents took me to used language in a very natural way. Either they used American Sign Language or they would speak English. And
Hmm.
that's what I was used to most of my life. It wasn't divided where they were using both languages at the same time. So that's been my journey pretty much. I never really did wish that I could hear or wish that I was hearing. No, I didn't ever feel that way. I think I had a very healthy childhood and I was with people, interacted with healthy friends and family in these settings.
Do you wish that there was something hearing people understood better about the deaf community or how they interacted with the deaf community? What flaws do you see in hearing people in the sense of a lack of understanding?
Yeah. It's interesting because my interactions with hearing people, I would say I prefer and I'm more comfortable with deaf individuals. I
Mm.
never really went to school. I was the only deaf person. So I never really was that person who was just the only deaf person. Like you're asking me what I felt like. In my elementary school, there were 40 deaf kids. And so there are 40 of us. So it was a huge program. And of course, the rest of the school was hearing students. But during lunchtime every day, we would sit in the table. I would sit on the tables with the deaf students. And maybe the next day I might sit at a different table with hearing students. But I really had very few hearing friends
Hmm.
because and those were my neighbors. Those are the kids that I played with after school and on the weekends. And they knew how to talk and interact with me. They learned how to finger spell. They learned some signs. And so I would say that, I would have birthday parties and sleepovers, and we would do this sort of whispering back and forth with each other. We couldn't do that kind of thing with my hearing friends, the lights off and sleepovers, and that was sort of an impediment. But we figured it out. We learned how to communicate in those settings. But I never really felt left out. And I think the reason why is because I always made my choice to be more with deaf individuals who were my age, deaf peers,
Okay.
um, during playtime and things like that. So yeah. Growing up, I don't really remember. I mean, I learned how to entertain myself. When I moved to Washington State, I went to the residential school for the deaf for 1 year, and there was a lot of wonderful interactions there. But I always felt like I liked my environment to include both hearing and deaf individuals in those classrooms, especially in high school. I had interpreters in high school. In elementary school, I did not have interpreters. But I remembered, I don't remember much that I learned. I remember one negative thing was learning how to read and write through hearing friends, like writing secrets. And I couldn't do that because my teacher, this was back in the 70s. And, if they had provided interpreters, the interpreter could have seen that I was using a hearing aid and speaking well. So they're like, oh, you don't need an interpreter. But I did need an interpreter.
Hmm.
And so I missed out on what the students were saying behind me, those secrets and stuff like that, where the teacher was talking. And I missed out on some of that interaction in the classroom. So I had to fill in the gaps myself. So as a hearing person, they're listening to all those conversations. I wasn't able to get that. So that's the one time I think I wish I would have had an interpreter. I think I would have had more equal access to education in that one area. But I started to develop, a social life after that. And I would say I'm pretty much an introvert. I like being alone. Um, I have few friends, mostly growing up, but I would say that in the workplace, when I work with hearing people, um, I've grown to become more of a self advocate in
Hmm.
that I make sure that they get what they need and I get and I have those accommodations that I need in those settings.
Um, do you think though that now in this current time, is there something you see that is a discrepancy between hearing people and people who can't hear that you think could be mended in some way so that they can connect? Because obviously we're all human, right? And I mean, I would say we're created in the image of God. And so there's just that difference in that one person hears and one person can't. So I guess how would you encourage, or do you see a way that they can be brought closer, or there's something that hearing people can do to be able to bridge the gap a little bit?
Yeah, well, I have a long list of things. I'm going to pick one for you. Language. Language. Like you said, God gave us language. God gave the deaf community sign language. And so I think what's more important is in media, we open up our eyes to exposure to that beautiful language. in movies. We see a lot more of that in videos and blogs and social media. We're starting to see more and more of American Sign Language out there through the use of social media. So I think that's a way that we fill in the gap. Um, I'm starting to learn slowly British Sign Language.
Hmm.
Uh, it's BSL. So British Sign Language is like this. It's BSL, and that means British Sign Language, what I just did with my hands. And so, as a deaf person, I would sign something like this. I'm British. So I just learned that from a British sign language person. So I'm learning how to bridge that gap because sign languages are not the same throughout the world. They're not the same. Um, we have Gestuno, which is a universal sign language, but today people are starting to learn more and more sign language. For example, my husband and our friends, we can't have secrets in public because people out there are picking up on sign language and can see and read what we're signing. So we have to be careful. In the 1970s, it wasn't that way. We could get away with that. But now, like we could sign in public and nobody knew. But now we have to be very careful what we're signing in public. So, and also with parents too, 95% of deaf children are born to parents who are hearing. So the parents, 72% of them don't learn sign language to communicate with their children.
Hmm.
And we have data that shows that's evidence that proves that children ages 4, but going into preschool, go in with little or no language in those situations. And that's a big problem. So it's really time for us to talk about this now because great time for us to talk about this now because I just flew in from being in Chicago. And I'll show you. There I am. I'm in Chicago. uh, and the reason I'm here is that there's a conference. And the conference is the National Association of the Deaf, the NAD. The organization was established, I think, in the year 1880. It's the oldest organization, and their function or their primary goal is to protect and promote and cherish or preserve uh, the deaf people and the language rights of deaf people and culture. So to
Hmm.
preserve that, that's their goal. That's their longest standing goal in all these years since 1880. So it's been a long history. And I went to some workshops or I'm going to be going to workshops July 4th. So I'm very excited to be seeing this. It's called Lead K. And I think it's something about equal access lead. What is it called? Lead, um, edu lead, language education access for kindergartners, Lead K. What it stands for is there's a bill that was passed in the year 2014. And the bill focuses on deaf children to make sure that they have language before they go into kindergarten. That's what that bill is all about. So to me, this is truly very important.
And
Uh,
this bill passed already?
22 states have passed it.
Okay.
Yeah. In California was the first, and I became a spokesperson for Lead K. And then the second spokesperson is a person named Niall DeMarco, who really, I think shows the importance of this bill to protect deaf children and their rights to language access, whether it's spoken or sign language or whatever they need, but that's put in there so that the parents know that sign language is one of the options. And some children who have cochlear implants or hearing aids, they still need to have, they don't have equal access with just those things. They need to have 100% access to information that's in schools. And so that's what that bill is all about.
So when you were
And so
mentioning the,
I'm hoping that the federal government will pass a law that will require all deaf children to have um, a language foundation and get for to go into school.
when you mentioned the 72% or the 74% of parents who don't interact with their
70,
children,
72%.
72%,
Don't
is it
sign.
is it because of a lack of knowledge, or is it because they're afraid to interact with their child who's deaf? Or
Well, there's many reasons for that. From my experience as a deaf teacher, working with deaf and hard of hearing children, would say that parents I see again and again, what they're saying is they just don't have the resources. Or where are the sign language classes? Where can they go? I think the government should provide free sign language classes to parents who have deaf children so
hmm,
they can learn it along with their child as they're growing. Um, and to provide those resources to balance that out, so that ASL is an option and it's scientifically proven. It's literature based that we have. If you focus on just the oral aspects of language for deaf children, many of those children won't learn. But hearing children, they go into mainstream schools and they learn to speak, but they're getting false hopes that that's the way to go about education. If you look at the child as a whole child, right? It's a whole child approach. You want to look at the child and their development. And so for me, fortunately, with little resources when I was growing up, um, I got educated by my father. He didn't know about sign language and speaking or signing, and so I observed. I saw the observation, I saw the expressions, but I remember looking at, after 18 months, my father realized that my voice was different and that most babies cried in a certain way. And I wasn't crying like other babies. And he wondered what was going on. And back then, there was no technology to really help him as he was, searching to figure out what was happening. He was thinking, should I give her hearing aid? Should I learn to sign? And so my father gave me everything at that point.
hmm,
And he learned sign with me as I was growing up. Plus, he was also, using speech and giving me a hearing. I had hearing aids. And so I was put into different programs to make sure that I was in the right fit so that I could develop in those programs. And he watched to see how I did in those different programs to see. And eventually, sign language was the one that won out. And spoken language is not normal for a deaf person. If you're doing one on one training and you do a lot of training, you can pick up some of it like the hearing person would, I guess, internalize English by, all the stuff that we hear incidentally in the world that you pick up. Parents, yelling at sisters and brothers and getting in trouble and the deaf child not understanding or knowing why, what's wrong or what's right. You don't pick up on that incidental learning. And so there's so much that is left out when sign
right.
language is not included.
Hmm.
So it's not, yeah, it doesn't include everything.
Well, does I was going to ask, do most parents, if they're going to have any ASL help, do they have to pay out of pocket, or is it even something that insurance pays, or is it not even a thing? Because I know,
Right. Well,
with
that's why I'm saying I really think that Lead K, this organization that I was talking about, the bill, it's supportive of families and parents, especially sisters and brothers who are in the family. Anybody who's in the family, they want to support them. We would have mentors go into those homes and teach the family sign language, and that would be provided for from the government through Lead K. That's the idea: is that the government grants would provide that maybe nonprofit organizations. There's one called NorCal from Northern California, and they have 8 sister agencies right now in California, all along California, that are working very hard to make sure that they provide more of those resources. And many parents are not aware of the fact that ASL might really help their children.
yeah,
They think that, oh no, I don't want them to I do that. I want them to speak. Speaking is better. We'll use that as a second or third option, but that's not really research based. Research is really showing more that oral programs alone don't work, but when a child knows sign language, you see a big difference than a child who's just raised in an oral environment. You see a difference in their cognitive processing and cognitive development, huge difference in their ability to perform, And parents are not really seeing those statistics, that they're not getting that data.
Hmm.
Plus, doctors are also telling parents, no, you shouldn't learn sign language. So doctors are misleading. There's a lot of misleading information out there. There's really no evidence or research that's showing that if a child learns to sign, they won't learn to speak. There's no research that proves that, but that's what they're telling them. So,
Hmm.
so are getting imbalanced resources and information. And
Hmm.
hopefully at the federal level, through Lead K, this bill that I'm talking about, this will start to change things. And we'll see uh, more sign language being provided. And, this would be beautiful because this child could be signing at home. And oftentimes the kids in a home and their parents are talking and they don't understand it. And that feels like neglect. That's child abuse when there's not full access to communication for that child. It's like not giving them food. So we need to really think about the stimulation of the brain that needs to happen. Spiritual stimulation too. There's a lack of when that communication isn't in place. And so that's why I'm here in Chicago. That's why I'm going to these workshops. And I'm watching a woman named Sherry Farina, who is an advocate. She's a specialist, and she's providing this workshop. And she has her team there working on these bills and really pushing for parents' rights. Um, and also to get those resources and to get the data out there to show people what's happening.
Hmm. Deanne, for you as an actress, have you faced any difficulties not being able to hear? I'm sure because you know your capabilities best, because you've been able to learn and live life doing this, signing, being deaf for a long time. So for you, this is very comfortable. You know what to do. But obviously, a lot of people don't understand, and there's a lack of knowledge. And also, I mean, my opinion, and please tell me if this is wrong, Hollywood doesn't seem um, super adaptable in environment, honestly. What what has your experience been in Hollywood being a deaf actress?
Well, have you watched My Husband at all? Do you know who my husband is?
I know who he is. I don't know though if I've seen any of his work.
Oh, okay. Well, have you have you seen CODA? This CODA stands for Child of Deaf Adults, and my husband Troy won Best Actor for that movie, Oscar. So we're all very, very proud of him. And he doesn't speak a word; he only uses sign language. And so maybe you could Google that and watch. His name is Troy Kotsur,
Hmm.
um, and he gives his Oscar speech. It was about 2 years ago. Google that and watch and see what he comments about being in Hollywood. And a lot of my friends and family see this. And he had an interpreter. He had a voice interpreter that, if you watch his face, but you don't see the interpreter at all. You're just seeing Troy there, and it's amazing. It's amazing to see him up there, um, to see him giving his acceptance speech. He's a brilliant actor, brilliant. For 30 years, he's been acting. And when we met as actors at the Deaf West Theater back in 1993 or 94. Um, and now with his Oscar, 2 months ago, he got an a honorary PhD from North Carolina University with a bunch of his credibility, with all of his credibility. Hollywood is now starting to listen to him. So that I wanted to say that first. Um, but yeah, he's on my team. I mean, I would say that specifically, he gets signed, he gets work. So far, he's had 5 projects. People want to work with him. They're really starting to listen to him. They're providing him with what he needs. They're listening to him because the Oscar speaks. Me, I don't have a name. So yes, I don't really have that kind of a name. People don't know me. Maybe Deaf West actress or some small parts that I've had over the years, some shows, but Sue Thomas FBI I was really happy. That was sort of a happy mistake that I got involved in that. Wonderful writer David Johnson and Joan Joas. Um, so they really had the mentality, they wanted to do it right. They really included me in the decision making process. And when I was filming in Canada, they used Deaf West theater models. They brought in the deaf community. Uh, they really did collaborate with the community, and they used the deaf community to help the show become stronger.
Hmm.
So we really had like 100 plus deaf people working on the set as crew and as actors, both. So we had a wonderful time. And I told the writers and the producers needed ASL script supervisors. And they said, we need a dialogue coach. A dialogue coach, meaning a person who could teach the characters sign language, because we had people signing throughout. So I wasn't there to teach them. I had to focus on my part, my role as an actress. So I had to let everybody else do all that other work to educate the crew and the cast about what was happening in the show, to
Hmm.
provide the authenticity and strength. I think that's the best way. So luckily, I worked at the right place in that setting. And now I've been working as a teacher for it's been since 1999. And the reason is because two actors in a family is not a great idea. We have a child, so we need somebody who has a stable life, who can bring home food to the table. And my husband I always felt he was a better actor. He was a better actor than me. And he's like, no, you're the better actress. And I'm like, no, we fought about it. But I'm like, you go, you pursue your acting. I'll work. And it was a struggle for him. It was not easy. Uh,
Hmm.
so that kind of entertainment business can be tough, but he broke through the barriers and made it. What a blessing to see him and to see him on that journey and be where he's at now. And he says, I can't imagine you teaching forever. Come back to acting. So with his name getting more and more recognition, it can help me pull myself back in and get more parts and stuff. So I really want to produce. That's kind of what I want to do.
What you mentioned your child, and forgive my ignorance, is your child hearing or deaf?
She's a coda. So she doesn't call herself hearing. When she was 5, I was trying to explain to her, I said, okay, so you have about deaf culture and hearing culture, and there's certain sensitivities, certain things that hearing people do and deaf people do. And she would say to people like, hey, don't call me hearing. I'm not hearing. I'm a coda. So coda stands for child of deaf adults. And you're raised in a household with two deaf parents. I do sign with her. I would sign with her maybe the first 4 or 5 years of her life
Hmm.
until she went into school. And then at that point, I started also using my voice back and forth. So I would do some sign language and some voicing with her. But she's always just signed with her dad. And she really identifies as a coda, not hearing or deaf, but coda. And I would say it's almost like, I don't know if this is a good comparison, but like a heritage language learner, right? So if the child's parents moved here from, let's say, Italy, and the parents are speaking Italian, but they know a little bit of English, the child is then born in America and learns English through interacting in America. But they have this heritage culture, right?
Hmm.
So maybe it's a similar concept. I don't know, similar to that.
Yeah, that was actually my mother, so it
Culture,
makes a lot of
yeah,
sense.
it's a cultural thing. It's not a disability. You
Right.
know what I mean? It's culture. So it's how a coda views the world. And I can't speak for all codas, but definitely my daughter feels that way.
Were you scared being a mom? and like having a child? And I mean, did you ever experience any
Oh,
fear
no,
over
no.
that?
No, I was very excited to be a mom. My husband and I were thrilled to become parents.
So then I'm gonna ask you, Deanne, what, because I think I'm assuming probably too much that that the fact that you can't hear impacts your life. Probably I'm thinking it impacts it more than it does. For you, what has been the hardest struggle or something in your life that has been hard or challenging that you have walked through and see the world differently in a way?
Yeah, I think the deaf community really does rely on technology. I was born at a time where I felt blessed and lucky because I wasn't alone as a deaf person. I grew up in natural settings where people interacted with each other. I interacted with my peers who were deaf and my hearing peers. And so that's where I learned, maybe it's because I had that environment. I'm more open-minded. I have a cultural understanding. I'm from Ohio, so I really, Sue Thomas, FBI, being on that show really gave me an experience of she herself, sorry, Sue Thomas, she didn't like being deaf. Her journey was completely different than mine. So maybe it's the location of where I grew up. Maybe that's why. Maybe some people look down on deaf people, but I felt like sometimes I would run into people who would try to mumble or speak unclearly or not look at me or ignore me or look away. And I would just turn off my voice and write my communication on a piece of paper. And if they didn't understand me, I would force them to read what I was writing, even if they didn't want to read it, just like hand it to them. So I think that kind of it didn't make me feel bitter. I would just ignore people like that. Their loss. But in the business world, if I had to order something, I would usually write on a piece of paper because that's their job is to read that, to communicate with me. So, yeah, I don't let it bother me. I just have my way of adjusting to communication out there in the world. I'm able to, I don't talk on the phone. I remember, when I was in my 20s, I was frustrated about the phone, how I couldn't hear everything. And people were talking on the phone a lot. And that frustrated me a little bit. And then one day somebody said, "Are you deaf? What are you deaf?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm deaf." And then I hung up the phone when I was trying to talk with him. So, but right now, technology is such that it really supports all individuals. Deaf, hearing, we can all communicate in different ways and we can connect more because right now I can see you on this podcast and we can text each other. So there's no barriers like there used to be in communication. There isn't just the one way that it used to be, when we only had telephones. So I think technology has really improved communication.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I would agree with that 100%. Um, uh,
I also,
kind
I also wanted to add, I think what's important too is we have deaf and hearing who are more patient. Both deaf and hearing are more patient with this communication process in interacting. It's not just about deaf people being patient, but hearing and deaf learning to slow down, try harder to interact.
hmm, yeah. Um, I wanted to, several questions ago, you mentioned that you figured out your identity pretty early in life. What is your identity? Because I have interviewed numerous people, many of whom do not know what their identity is. Maybe it's their job, it's their career, it's their family. Um, But to be honest, most of the people I've talked with are not really sure. That's something they're still trying to figure out. So for you, you said I found it early on and I know what it is. What is that identity for you?
Yeah. My preschool teacher was deaf, was a deaf leader. She educated my parents about what the deaf community could provide for their daughter, me. I went to deaf camp. I went to deaf events. My teacher also would say, did you know that at home, there's schools right here? Our home is like only 4 houses away from the school. And so that school had a very good pilot program that brought back a lot more sign language into the school because it was a pilot program. We brought kids from all over. So there was added information. So in the year 1880, um, in Italy, there was a big conference, deaf education conference, where they voted to focus on hearing oral approaches for deaf children in education. But before that, sign language was used. And so at this conference, it really robbed us of our natural language. And from that point on, we went through sort of what we call the dark ages of deaf education from 1880 all the way until the 1960s. We were in the dark ages of this forced oralism, forced sort of punishing us or making us speak and try to hear. And they would actually hit deaf people's hands if they tried to sign. It's very abusive. I was actually born after that time. I never experienced any of those horrific events. I heard about them, but I didn't experience them. And I was in a program where sign language came back. That's when sign language started to come back. So I didn't feel like I was missing out on anything. My identity is strong. I had peers. I knew who I was. I could use sign language. I could interact with them. But, and back to your question, how do I know what my identity is? So my father sat me down in the kitchen one day. I was probably about 10 or 11. And he said, Deanne, you're not deaf, you're hard of hearing. You're speaking, you're developing your speaking skills. You can hear a little bit in your left ear, the right ear, I can't hear anything, but in the left ear, I can hear some. And he said, you're not really deaf, you're hard of hearing. And I looked at him, and my preschool teacher was the one that told my father about this particular family, a deaf family who had two moms who were deaf, and they adopted two Korean children. One was a boy, my age. And this was, again, the preschool teacher that I was talking about. And they said, why don't you take your friends to this family? So that's how my father grew in his understanding of me and my identity through this particular interaction with this family. And my dad wanted me to be a role model for these deaf adults, or he wanted me to have role models, excuse me, from these deaf adults because I didn't have role models in the house. So that journey brought me into that world. And my father provided all of that access for me as a young girl. So my journey, again, is not like any deaf person out there. We all have very different roads that we've traveled. We've traveled many different, some I find their identity way later in life. Some do, at birth, early age. But I remember my father telling me, you're hard of hearing. And I argued with him and said, no, I'm not. I'm deaf. So then we explained something in the 1970s. Hard of hearing meant that the person couldn't sign very well. They didn't interact with the deaf community very well or deaf people. They weren't involved in the deaf community. And that would be, maybe we'd call small d deaf, right? Um, but I felt like I related to them. I could also develop a hard of hearing sort of identity, meaning, I mean, it took me years to learn to speak and to be able to listen, but I was able to pick up sign language, not easily, but over a period of time. And so I thought, no, hard of hearing people are not just separate, they're part of the deaf community. It's natural for me to learn both. So today in 2024, I'm seeing more and more people commenting about being hard of hearing and also signing really well. Or talk, they talk on the phone, but they also use American Sign Language fluently. And so there's more of an openness to not categorizing with one label or another, but I remember my dad was like, well, you have to have an identity. We're going to call it hard of hearing. But at that time, even then, I knew that you couldn't just call me one thing. I belonged to both the deaf community and I was also functioning as a hard of hearing person. So identity is an interesting thing. I think it's a very important piece. And lots of people out there might want to identify me in their own way. But I think what's important is I know my own particular journey and my own identity. I'm the one that makes that label. It's a complex question. It's a complex question with a complex answer.
No, I think what I'm trying to think of, maybe I posed the question wrongly. It's more of what gives you meaning in life? What makes life meaningful and worth living? Because that kind of drives, at least when I've talked to people and interviewed them, that's kind of the core of why they're around. That's kind of their identity. This is what I'm associated with. This is what I live for. And I can tell, even just by talking with you for 45 minutes, I mean, you are passionate about the deaf community. You are passionate about wanting the deaf community to be able to be the best they can be and be able to have all the resources that they need. And so I wanted to,
I'm not passionate about the deaf people. I'm passionate about quality of language. That's what I'm passionate about. I'm an ASL teacher, and I believe deaf children need language, sign language, quality.
right.
Passionate about that. That's my identity. If they want to learn through their ears, through their mouth, that's their own personal journey and that's their decision. But I am passionate supporting deaf people. And maybe my meaning for being here is, God's gift has given me sign language so that I can support deaf people in my journey. And I think that's my belief. But also, I'm passionate to provide uplifting stories about life. If a person happens to be deaf, or a person happens to be Black, or a person happens to be whatever in a wheelchair, um, we all have we all have similarities, and everyone has their own individual story, their own individual intersectionality, their own ways or layers of identities that they carry as a
Yeah.
woman, as a deaf woman, as maybe a Mexican woman. All of these different layers become who a person is. So that's my passion is is language and protecting that very precious language.
Well, Deanne, I mean, thank you too for clarifying that. That's helpful. I guess one last question for you, because I want to be respectful of your time. It's kind of maybe a much more fun question, I suppose. Um, if you could relate your personality to an animal, what type of animal would you pick?
Hmm. My first response would be the dog. So cats too. They can be your best friends or not. Like cats can be like, well, maybe I'm your best friend and maybe I'm not. So, but dogs, I feel like, yeah, I would choose a dog. I'm very close to an Australian Shepherd. Um, they're very bright. I think they make my husband makes my husband and I laugh all the time. So we're always laughing. He's always laughing, and the dog's coming up along with us. So yeah. But I have two books that I would like for to recommend for you to read, and also the listeners who are listening in. If you really want to understand more about deaf identity or deaf individuals, one is called what's it called? Show Me a Sign. The name of it is Show Me a Sign, and it's a history of fiction about a town, an island called Martha's Vineyard. And on that island was an actual real place where hearing and deaf people didn't know the difference between their identities, and everybody just signed in Martha's Vineyard. The whole community signed. And so it's a story about a
Hmm.
girl who's 11 and she's deaf, and it's just her view of the world. And she has no idea about hearing people being separate or different or having a struggle as a deaf person. She doesn't realize that until she goes over to Baltimore, and she's shocked, and she sees there that hearing people look down on her. So this girl Mary uh, was raised on this island, and it's a fictional character. However, her great great grandfather actually did was a person who you can look him up, is John Lambert, and he actually brought he came over from England to Martha's Vineyard as a deaf person and used sign language on the island. So he was one of them on the island. Late 17th century
Hmm.
was when he arrived. And everybody in that on that island, all the families use sign language. So hearing or deaf. So it's a great book.
Wow.
Because I have three books. So she first one is Show Me a Sign that I just mentioned. What was the second book? I had a second book I was going to tell you. And now I just forgot it. The third one, Sail Me Away from Home. Oh, and the second one is Set Me Free. It's about a little girl named Mary who grows up. There's three books, and you can see her journey through these three different books. So she's 11 in the first book, the second one she's 14, and the third book she's a young adult, and she becomes a teacher and is teaching hearing and deaf children
So this is a series.
sign language. Yeah, it's a series. And then another book that maybe because of the questions you asked me today, I think maybe you might enjoy, thinking of a negative view of deafness. Maybe you might enjoy reading a book called "Give Me a Sign." It's different from these series on Martha's Vineyard that I was just mentioning, but that book is a novel, and the writer is also deaf, and they grew up in a family of deaf and blind members. And this
Hmm.
person was inspired to write a story about camp, and it's camp stories. But this girl is curious about sign language and is confused about her identity. And she's deaf, so she has a hearing aid and a cochlear implant. But then she goes to camp, and she learns so much from interacting with other people that she starts to develop her own identity. So that's a really good one for I use that one for my high school students who are 14, 15, 16. So that's a great one. I think you might enjoy reading that one as well. The author's name is Anna Sorin, Sorina. I think it's Sorina. Sorina, Anna Sorina. It's called Give Me a Sign. So I do recommend that you read that one. And again, Show Me a Sign and Give Me a Sign are different. They're totally different books. So not to
Yeah.
confuse. I hope you enjoy reading those.
Oh, I love getting book suggestions, so thank you. I'm actually almost done with the book I'm reading now, so it's perfect timing. Well,
Great.
Deanne, thank you so much for this
Are you a
interview.
book reader? Are you a good book reader?
Me? Yes. Yes, I love books.
What books? Oh, what book are you reading right now?
Um, it's called Amari, actually. I have a friend who wants to become a children's author, and she loves young adult children's books. And so she is always recommending them to me. And I have kind of shunned the idea for a while because I love classics like Crime and Punishment and Jane Eyre with these like big, heavy topic questions. But she really wanted me to read it. And so I've started it and I love it. It's really good. And I'm halfway through it. So I've surprised myself. Sorry to the offer if you're listening to this. I definitely did not mean to be offensive, but I do. I'm enjoying it. I just didn't expect to. So,
Books are wonderful. It introduces you to characters when you go out into the world, maybe places or ideas that you've never been able to meet in real life.
yeah.
Give me a sign that Camp Stories. My husband bought the rights to that particular book, and Troy is wanting to direct it and create he's talking with a production company, so maybe we'll be able to make a movie out of that one. Give me a sign. So we'll see.
You could be the producer.
Yes, right, exactly. Right now, I'm producing. Yes,
Well, Deanne, thank you. Thank you so much for your time, especially flying in. And
your time too. Thank you for contacting me. I appreciate it.
you're welcome. Well, thank you. And listeners, again, you're listening to Deanne Bray. You're listening to her interpreter's voice, but again, if you're seeing the video, you'll actually see her signing, which I highly recommend. She's very expressive. So it'll be a fun watch too. All right, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you to Cass for interpreting and taking your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Good night.